Imagine a child standing in the shadow of their parent, holding up a drawing with pride, waiting for a smile, a nod, a simple, "I'm proud of you." But instead, there's silence or worse, a dismissive glance that says, "You can do better." This moment, small to the outside world, becomes everything to the child. It's the first time they feel invisible. Not because they are, but because the person meant to see them is too busy seeing only themselves. And so begins the wound, a silent fracture that hides beneath good grades, polite smiles, and a desperate hunger for love that never feels quite safe. Carl Jung once said, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parent." And what is narcissistic parenting if not a child forced to carry what never belonged to them? If you grew up in an environment where love felt like a reward, where approval was conditional, and your worth depended on how well you mirrored someone else's expectations, then you weren't really seen, you were performed. The mirror you held up was never for you. It was to reflect their image back at themselves. You became the applause for their ego, the fix for their brokenness, the placeholder for the life they couldn't live. That kind of upbringing doesn't just hurt, it shapes you. It alters your voice, your choices, even the way you look at yourself in the mirror. You start asking, "Who am I?" when no one is watching. Jung taught us that our unconscious stories often govern our lives until we dare to bring them into the light. And this is one of those stories. The child of a narcissistic parent doesn't just suffer in the moment. They carry that suffering like a second skin into adulthood, into relationships, into the quiet corners of their own minds. What if the voice that shaped your identity was never yours to begin with? What if your self-worth has always been measured by someone else's emptiness? This wound, it doesn't bleed, but it echoes. And in this series, we're going to look it in the eye, not to shame, but to understand. Because healing doesn't begin with blame. It begins with seeing clearly what you were never meant to carry. Not every parent who makes mistakes is narcissistic. But a narcissistic parent doesn't just make mistakes, they build a world where only their reflection matters. Through the lens of Carl Jung, narcissistic parenting isn't simply about arrogance or vanity. It's about projection, ego, inflation, and an inability to individuate. The narcissistic parent doesn't see the child as a separate being, they see them as an extension, a tool, a mirror. Individuation, in Jungian terms, is the process of becoming one's true self, separate from the collective, from parental influence, from the persona we wear to fit in. But the narcissistic parent blocks that path. They need control to feel secure. Their identity, often built on fragile foundations, depends on being admired, obeyed, and emotionally fed by their child. So they mold, they manipulate, and they mask it all as love. But it's not love. It's ownership. These are the parents who guilt you for having boundaries, who praise you not for being happy, but for making them look good. They dismiss your feelings, invalidate your needs, and call it tough love. They ask you to shrink so they can feel big, to stay silent so they can be heard. And if you push back, you're the ungrateful one, the dramatic one, the difficult child. Jung believed that what a person represses or denies in themselves becomes part of the shadow and unconscious part of the psyche that influences behavior in secret. Narcissistic parents, terrified of their own inadequacy, their own failures, project that shadow onto their children. They cannot bear to see their own flaws, so they label their child the problem. They don't correct their inner world, they control their outer one. And often, that outer world is you. If you ever felt like you were raised not as a person, but as a role helper, fixer, golden child, scapegoat, you've already met this pattern. This isn't just emotional neglect, it's identity theft. Because when the person who shaped your reality refuses to see you, they don't just distort the relationship, they distort your self-image. And before healing can begin, we have to call it what it is, not parenting but possession. In the chapters ahead, we'll explore what that means, how it shows up, and most importantly, how you can break free. Because awareness is the first act of liberation. There's something quietly devastating about growing up as a mirror instead of a child. When your parent looks at you, they don't see your curiosity, your essence, your uniqueness, they see themselves. or more specifically, who they wish they were. And in that moment, your existence becomes a project, not a presence. For the narcissistic parent, the child is not an individual with their own path, desires, or soul. The child is a canvas, a reflection, a means to fulfill unhealed ambitions. This isn't parenting. This is performance. Carl Jung spoke of projection, a psychological mechanism in which we cast our denied traits onto others. Narcissistic parents do this with uncanny precision. The parts of themselves they cannot accept, shame, insecurity, fear of failure, they bury deep in their unconscious. But that buried material doesn't disappear. It seeks a stage, and often that stage becomes their own child. Suddenly, your sensitivity is labeled weakness, your independence is defiance, your sadness is drama. Why? Because it mirrors something inside them they cannot face. So instead of nurturing you, they try to fix you. But you're not broken, you just never got the chance to be whole. When you're seen only through the lens of someone else's need for perfection, control, or admiration, you start to disappear. You become who they want you to be. You smile when you're hurting. You succeed because failure isn't allowed. You suppress your voice just to keep the peace. And one day you wake up wondering why it's so hard to know who you really are. That's the cost of being a mirror. Jung taught that the first step toward becoming ourselves is to face the parts of us we've long hidden. But how can you reclaim something you were never allowed to own? The child of a narcissist often grows up full of confusion, self-doubt, and the eerie sense that they're living someone else's life, because in many ways they are, until they stop, until they turn inward, until they break the mirror and ask the question no one else ever dared to answer: who am I when I am no longer performing? And in that silence, something begins to spark, a return, a remembering of the self that always was. It doesn't start with yelling. It starts with silence, with a sigh, a disappointed glance, a carefully chosen moment of withdrawal. The narcissistic parent doesn't need to scream to control. They control through implication, through guilt, through the subtle suggestion that your happiness is always conditional, that love must be earned, and that obedience is the only currency that matters. Carl Jung warned that what we repress within becomes a source of internal conflict, what he called the shadow. For narcissists, the shadow is terrifying. It's full of shame, inadequacy, powerlessness, truths they cannot face. And so, instead of integrating that shadow, they disown it. They cast it outward, and often onto their most vulnerable target, their child. Suddenly, your refusal to comply becomes betrayal. Your emotional needs are seen as manipulation. Your independence is selfishness. It's not that you're wrong, it's that your truth threatens their illusion. The illusion that they are all-knowing, always right, always in control. Emotional manipulation is their weapon of choice. One moment they praise you, the next they withdraw. They'll remind you of everything they've done for you, not to show love, but to bind you in obligation. After everything I've sacrificed, they'll say, as if your existence is a debt to repay. But love isn't a transaction, and guilt is not love's language. Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." The narcissist cannot make peace with their inner world, so they twist yours. They plant fear in your decisions, shame in your needs, confusion in your boundaries. And if you ever try to set yourself free, they call it abandonment, because for them, control feels like love. For you, it feels like a trap. What's most insidious is how long this dynamic can last. Long after you leave the home, their voice lives inside you. You question yourself, you shrink. You apologize for simply existing. But that inner conflict, that war between who you are and who you were told to be, is not yours to carry. It's inherited, projected, imposed, and it can end. Not with revenge, not with convincing them to change, but with reclaiming your story, one truth at a time. Because the real act of liberation begins the moment you stop playing their role and start writing your own script. To survive in a home where love is conditional and identity is inconvenient, the child begins to shape-shift. Slowly, silently, they construct what Jung called the persona mask, designed not to express who they are, but to protect who they must hide. The false self is born not out of deceit, but out of necessity. When your true feelings are dismissed, when your boundaries are mocked, when your needs make you too much, you learn to adapt. You smile when you're breaking. You agree when your gut screams no. You become the version of yourself that your parent finds acceptable. And the tragedy? You do it so well, even you start to forget what's real. Carl Jung saw the persona as the socially acceptable face we wear in order to function in society. But when that mask becomes our identity, we lose connection with the deeper self, the soul, the unconscious, the authentic I. For the child of a narcissist, the persona isn't just a social strategy. It becomes survival. You become the peacemaker, the achiever, the good girl, the silent son. You mold yourself into something manageable, something useful. But in doing so, you bury the raw, vibrant parts of yourself that were deemed too difficult or too emotional. And though this false self may earn praise, it leaves you hollow. You get the applause, but it never feels real because it's not for the real you. The cost of this adaptation is steep: emotional disconnection, chronic self-doubt, a constant sense of fraudulence, even in success, and worst of all, an identity built on performance rather than presence. You begin to wonder, if I stopped pretending, would anyone stay? Would anyone love me if I stopped being what they need and started being who I am? These are not small questions. They're the beginning of awakening, because behind the mask lies the self you were always meant to be. Not obedient, not ornamental, just real. And to return to that self, you'll have to grieve. Grieve the years spent playing a role. Grieve the love you never truly received. And most importantly, grieve the parts of you that were exiled just for being honest. Only then can the false self begin to fall away. Only then can the real one rise. In a narcissistic family, love isn't unconditional, it's strategic, and survival becomes a matter of role assignment. Jung taught that the family is a collective psyche, a system of unconscious forces shaping each member's identity. But in the narcissistic household, those roles are not born from love. They're born from control. And two of the most common ones are the golden child and the scapegoat. The golden child is the chosen one, the favorite, the projection of all the parents' unfulfilled dreams. They're praised not for who they are, but for how well they reflect the parent's ideal. Their achievements aren't celebrated, they're claimed. The golden child becomes a trophy, but that praise comes at a price: the pressure to perform, the fear of failure, the complete erasure of the inner world. There's no room for doubt, sadness, or individuality, only success, obedience, and perfection. Then there's the scapegoat, the black sheep, the one who refuses to play along or simply can't hide their pain. The scapegoat becomes the repository for the parent's shadow wall, their unacknowledged shame, anger, and inadequacy projected onto the child. If anything goes wrong, it's their fault. They are criticized, blamed, and often exiled. But here's the paradox: both roles are traps. The golden child may seem privileged, but they're imprisoned by expectation. The scapegoat may seem rejected, but they're often closer to the truth. Jung would say that both roles prevent individuation, the sacred process of becoming who you truly are. Because neither child is free. One is loved for being someone they're not. The other is unloved for being someone the parent fears. And both grow up with the same question: am I worthy as I am? The golden child learns to chase love. The scapegoat learns to fear it. One becomes addicted to approval. The other becomes allergic to it. But neither knows peace. Neither knows self. Until they begin to break the pattern. Until they step out of the role. Until they stop asking, what do they want from me? And start asking, what do I want for myself? These roles are not destiny. They are trauma scripts. And once you see them, you can rewrite them. Because you were never born to be a reflection or a dumping ground. You were born to be whole. In the home of a narcissistic parent, love is not a gift freely given. It is a transaction. a subtle negotiation masked as affection. Do what they want, get attention. Disappoint them, feel the cold. Slowly, without even realizing it, the child learns a dangerous lesson. Love is earned, not felt. It's not unconditional, it's contractual. Every smile, every hug, every approving word is linked to behavior that serves the parent's needs. You become excellent not because you want to grow, but because being good is the only safe way to belong. You comply not out of connection, but out of fear, fear of rejection, abandonment, or emotional exile. Carl Jung understood the difference between authentic love and ego-driven need. Real love, he believed, allows for freedom. It celebrates individuality. But the narcissist cannot offer real love, because their love is filtered through the lens of self, how it reflects on them, how it serves them, how it upholds the fantasy of their superiority. They don't love the child, they love how the child makes them feel. And so, the child is trained like an emotional performer. Do well, and you're loved. Stray too far from the script, and the curtain drops. Over time, this damages the very core of the child's being. As an adult, you find yourself over-functioning in relationships, giving too much, tolerating too little. Not because you love deeply, but because you've been conditioned to believe that love must be bought with sacrifice. You second-guess compliments. You fear being truly seen. You apologize for needing anything at all. Why? Because love was never modeled as safety, it was modeled as strategy. You can spot this wound in the way you flinch when someone shows genuine care. In the way you push people away or chase after those who withhold. Jung taught that the ego seeks security, but the soul seeks truth. And the truth is, you were never unlovable. You were simply taught that love had to be negotiated. But real love, soul-level love, asks nothing of you except your presence. No performance, no perfection, just truth. To heal is to stop earning what should have been given freely. To heal is to say, I am enough, even if no one claps. That is how the transaction ends. That is how love becomes love again. When you grow up under the rule of a narcissistic parent, rage doesn't disappear, it retreats. It hides beneath the surface, boiling quietly in places you learn not to touch. As a child, you weren't allowed to be angry. You couldn't express your pain, your frustration, your no. Any resistance was met with guilt, dismissal, or punishment. So, you swallowed it. You made yourself small. You told yourself to be grateful. And that anger? It didn't vanish. It became part of your shadow. Carl Jung described the shadow as the unconscious part of the psyche where we store everything we can't accept about ourselves, our instincts, our emotions, our unmet needs. But here's the truth. What we bury doesn't die. It waits. And when left unintegrated, it eventually finds a way to leak into our lives, our relationships, our self-image. For the child of a narcissist, the shadow is often full of suppressed rage, helplessness, and shame. You weren't allowed to feel, so now you don't know how. You weren't allowed to speak, so now your throat tightens when it's time to tell the truth. And worst of all, you may find yourself becoming what you hated, exploding over little things, lashing out, or attracting people who repeat the same cycles of control and invalidation. Jung warned, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Suppressed anger doesn't stay quiet forever. It becomes projection, blaming others for feelings you've never dared to feel, or it becomes implosion, turning inward as anxiety, depression, or chronic self-criticism. You ask, why do I sabotage myself? But the real question is, what am I not allowing myself to feel? Healing begins when we stop fearing our anger, when we stop judging the parts of ourselves that were punished for simply wanting to be heard. That anger isn't your enemy, it's your compass. It points to where your boundaries were broken, where your truth was denied, where your voice was stolen. And when you finally allow that rage to speak, not to harm, but to be seen, you begin to reclaim your wholeness. You stop living in fragments, you stop projecting, and you start integrating. Because the shadow, once acknowledged, doesn't destroy, it heals. And in that integration, you don't just find your anger, you find your power. You leave the house, but the house doesn't leave you. You move into adulthood believing you're free, independent, finally in control. But then, without warning, you find yourself drawn to people who make you feel the same way your parent did: dismissed, invisible, not enough. You fall into friendships where you're constantly giving, romantic relationships where you're walking on eggshells, workplaces where no matter how hard you try, it's never quite good enough. And deep down, you wonder, why do I keep ending up here? The answer, as Jung taught, is in the unconscious. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. The child who was never seen spends their adult life trying to be seen, not by everyone, just by the ones who won't. It's not a choice, it's a compulsion. The inner child keeps reaching for the same kind of love, hoping this time it will feel different, but it doesn't. You recreate the emotional climate of your childhood, not because you want to suffer, but because you want to master it. You want to win the love that was denied to you. And the ego whispers, if I can make them love me, maybe I wasn't the problem after all. But that's not healing, it's looping. And the loop doesn't break until you recognize the pattern, until you see that the person you're trying to fix isn't in front of you, it's behind you. It's the ghost of unmet needs. The echo of a parent who couldn't love beyond themselves. Jung believed that we repeat not out of weakness, but out of longing to complete what was left undone. But completion doesn't come from reenactment. It comes from awareness, from saying, I see what this is, I know where this comes from, and I don't need to repeat it to release it. That's when the pattern starts to fade. That's when you begin to choose differently, not because you're afraid, but because you're awake. The wound may still be there, but you no longer live inside it. And that, in itself, is a revolution. There's a kind of ache that never fully goes away, the ache of being unloved by the one who was supposed to love you first. It lingers like a ghost in the background of your life, showing up in the quiet moments, when someone forgets your birthday, when you're not chosen, when you feel too much or not enough. This is the wound of the abandoned child, the unseen child, the one who had to become an adult too soon. Jung recognized this figure, the wounded child, not just as a personal experience, but as an archetype, a symbol of collective pain. It is the part of us that was hurt, yes, but also the part of us that holds the key to transformation. Because here's the paradox: the wound that seems unhealable is often the very thing that awakens us. Jung believed that what is held in consciousness, what is named, felt, and integrated, can become a source of wisdom. Not immediately, not easily, but inevitably, if we are brave enough to face it. That aching place inside you, it's not weakness. It's the doorway. It's where your compassion was born. It's where your sensitivity comes from. It's why you notice what others miss, why you can hold space for pain others run from. But to reach that wisdom, you must stop trying to erase the wound. You must stop pretending it didn't hurt. Because healing isn't erasure, it's integration. It's standing in front of your younger self and saying, you didn't imagine it. You weren't too much. You deserved love. And in that moment, the child who was never protected finally meets the adult who can. What if your deepest pain is your greatest teacher? What if the thing you've spent your whole life trying to forget is the very thing trying to guide you home? This wound may never completely vanish, but it can evolve. It can soften, it can teach, and in time, it can become less of a cage and more of a compass. Because the wound doesn't define your worth, it reveals your depth. And the more gently you hold it, the more power it returns to you. There comes a moment quiet, almost imperceptible, when you stop asking, what do they want from me? And begin to ask, who am I really? That moment is the beginning of individuation, the lifelong process Jung described as becoming your true self. Not the self shaped by trauma, not the version approved by your parents' fragile ego, but the self buried beneath all the roles, masks, and performances. For the child of a narcissistic parent, individuation is not just a path, it's a rebellion. Because everything in your early environment taught you to fuse your identity with someone else's expectations. Your feelings were inconvenient. Your desires were disruptive. Your truth was muted. So you became what was needed. But now, to individuate, you must unlearn. You must peel back the layers of guilt, shame, and internalized blame. You must recognize the voice in your head that says, "You're being selfish," or "You're too much," or "You'll never be enough." And then you must realize, that voice isn't yours. It was planted, conditioned, repeated until it sounded like your own thoughts. But it's not truth, it's residue. Jung said the goal of individuation is to become the person you are meant to be. That begins with separation. Not just physical distance, but psychological sovereignty. The right to feel what you feel, to want what you want, to speak without fear of punishment or abandonment. It's a reclaiming of the self raw, messy, real, and it's not comfortable. It's terrifying to dismantle an identity that once kept you safe. But safety built on self-erasure is no safety at all. You're not betraying anyone by becoming yourself. You're ending a betrayal that began long ago, the betrayal of your own soul. Individuation is not about becoming perfect, it's about becoming whole. And wholeness means honoring every part of you, the anger, the grief, the joy, the desire. It means saying, "I no longer exist to be useful to others. I exist because I am." That alone is enough. That is the truth the narcissistic parent could never see, but you can. And in that seeing, you begin to return to yourself not as a reflection, but as a flame. You've waited long enough for the apology that never came, for the nurturing you never received, for someone to finally say, "You matter." But what if the one you've been waiting for is you? Reparenting the inner child isn't a trend. It's a necessity, especially for those raised by narcissistic parents who confused love with control and care with compliance. The child inside you, still waiting to be chosen, still aching to be heard, doesn't need another lecture. It needs presence. Jung believed that healing begins with conscious integration of the unconscious. That means listening to the parts of yourself you've silenced for years, the fear, the longing, the rage, the hope. Reparenting is about giving your inner child what your outer world never could. Not perfectly, but consistently. It starts small. A journal where you write letters to your younger self. A quiet walk where you let your feelings speak. A whisper in the mirror that says, "You didn't deserve that, and I'm sorry." These aren't acts of indulgence, they're acts of repair, because your worth was never supposed to hinge on someone else's wounds. And now, you get to rewrite that script. Therapy can help deeply. So can somatic work, meditation, voice dialogues, and even simple rituals of self-care. But at the core, it's about becoming the guardian you never had, setting boundaries and keeping them, feeling your emotions without apologizing for them, saying no without guilt, and saying yes to the life you want, not the one you were programmed to accept. You may stumble. You may hear the old voice, the one that questions every step. But now, you have a choice. You don't have to listen. You can speak back. You can say, "I see you, but I don't belong to you anymore." Jung once said, "Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens." Reparenting is the awakening. It is the moment you stop waiting to be saved and start offering yourself the care that was always deserved. Your inner child doesn't need you to be perfect. It just needs to know you're here now. And that, finally, someone is listening. Try setting a boundary with a narcissistic parent, and you'll often feel it immediately shift in the air, a pause in their tone, the subtle or overt accusation, "How could you?" In their world, your boundary is not self-care, it's betrayal. They taught you early that love means access, that if you care, you comply. That saying no is cruel, selfish, cold. So for years you didn't. You kept the peace by sacrificing your own. You stayed silent so they could speak louder. But eventually, silence becomes suffocating. And one day, something inside you breaks, not from rebellion, but from truth. You realize, a boundary isn't a wall, it's a door. It doesn't close you off, it lets you breathe. Carl Jung spoke of the necessity of separation for spiritual growth. Individuation, the process of becoming your true self, requires breaking from the psychic entanglement of childhood roles and parental control. To step into your own soul, you must first step away from their shadow. But narcissistic parents don't let go easily. They will guilt, they will shame. They will remind you of everything they've done, rewriting history to make themselves the hero. They will say you're abandoning them, destroying the family, becoming distant, but none of that is true. What's true is that you're claiming your space, your voice, your life, and that takes courage. The kind of courage that says, I am not here to manage your emotions, that says, my peace is not negotiable. Saying no isn't just self-defense, it's a sacred act of self-definition. Each time you honor a boundary, you affirm your right to exist independently, not as their mirror, not as their emotional caretaker, but as yourself, the self that no longer bends to avoid backlash, the self that no longer confuses enmeshment with closeness. It's not easy. You may lose their approval, you may lose the illusion of harmony, but what you gain is far more important, the freedom to be real. Boundaries are not barriers to love, they are the foundation of it, because real love, unlike control does, and punish you for being whole. There's a moment many survivors of narcissistic abuse reach, a moment when they whisper to themselves, I forgive you, and then wait for the peace to flood in, but it doesn't, not right away. And sometimes, not at all. Because forgiveness, for all its beauty, is not the same as healing, and it is not the same as reconciliation. Carl Jung reminded us that healing is not about rewriting someone else's story, it's about owning your own, and that means letting go not of pain, but of the illusion that the person who hurt you will ever change. Narcissistic parents rarely apologize, rarely take responsibility. They rewrite the past, they weaponize your pain, they see your truth as a threat to the image they've built. So you keep hoping, hoping one day they'll understand, hoping they'll finally say the words you needed as a child, but with each disappointment, the ache deepens, until you realize you are not healing by waiting for them. You are hurting. Forgiveness, then, becomes something else entirely. It becomes freedom not from the pain, but from the performance. It's saying, I no longer need you to acknowledge what you did in order for me to be whole. It's choosing to release the expectation that they will ever be who you needed, and that release is not an act of weakness. It's an act of sovereignty. Jung taught that transformation comes when we stop projecting and start integrating. That includes the hope that our parent will someday save the relationship. They won't. And when you let go of that hope, something strange happens. You stop shrinking. You stop begging. You stop returning to a door that was never meant to open. You start standing taller in your truth. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is not pretending. It is not letting them back in to hurt you again. It is simply saying, I am done waiting for you to make it right. I am choosing my peace over your permission. That's when the story changes. That's when the chains loosen. You no longer need to forgive to be free. You simply need to let go of who you thought they could be, and finally become who you truly are. There is a moment when the ache softens not because it disappears, but because you've stopped resisting it. You've stopped asking it to make sense, stopped waiting for someone else to fix it. You've looked it in the eye and said, you're mine now, and I will carry you differently. That's when everything begins to shift. Because true healing isn't about revenge. It isn't about proving anyone wrong or making them pay. It's about becoming what you needed, becoming the parent you never had, the one who doesn't shame your tears, the one who listens without judging, the one who says, you don't need to earn my love, you already have it. And slowly you realize, the love you longed for isn't gone. It's inside you now. You are the safe place. You are the warmth. You are the calm after the storm. Carl Jung taught us that transformation doesn't come from perfection. It comes from integration, from gathering the broken pieces and holding them with compassion. The wound may never fully vanish them, echoes are too deep. But it no longer has to define you. It doesn't have to dictate your choices, sabotage your relationships, or drown out your voice. It can become something else, a source of empathy, a guidepost, a quiet reminder of how far you've come. You are not broken. You are awakening. And that awakening is sacred. It is the unraveling of the false self and the rise of the real one. It is saying, I don't need to be who they wanted me to be. I don't need to perform to belong. I am allowed to exist, exactly as I am. That is the rebirth, not in spite of the wound, but through it. So if no one ever told you, let me be the one, you were never too much. You were never unlovable. You were just never mirrored by someone who could see past their own pain. But now you see. Now you know. And with that knowing comes freedom. This is not the end of your story. It's the beginning of a new one. You get to write, not out of fear, but out of truth. So speak softly to your inner child. Build boundaries like shelter. Offer yourself the tenderness you once begged for. You are the parent now, and you're doing beautifully. This story was intense. But this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.